Hi.
Not doing anything.
Welcome to my presentation. Welcome to JavaPolis 2006. And thanks for interrupting your lunch to come to my presentation. I'm going to be talking about Rearchitecting legacy J2EE. That is 1.4 with Spring and Hibernate. I first gave this presentation back in the UK for the Java Web Users Group, which I am the founder and organizer, obviously Jug leader. So I call myself a JavaEE software design artist because what we do every day is creative, at least that's what I think. So we're going to learn how to re-architect fully Java Enterprise Edition applications with Spring Framework and Hibernate. So I'm working for investment banks for the best part of 8 years. So obviously that means IT, and I have a decade's worth of experience working with Java. If you're going to re-architect an application, then you really need to have a really great architecture in the first place. Especially if you have a legacy application, can you re-architect your application? That's the first question. Well, in Chris Richardson's presentation that happened earlier on, he said one of the stumbling blocks is your database. It might be using stored procedures. And there are other reasons, of course. You might have a high volume, say a trading application, and it might be resistance to not really migrate an existing application. But as time goes on, you need to stay up to date with technology, otherwise you can't recruit any developers, and then your application goes down to maintenance mode, and then it disappears off the face of the planet. So an agile approach is really good. So in Spring, if you've never used any Spring before in a J2EE setting, the JNDI object factory method bean is really useful. You eliminate a lot of your JIND lookups, no try and catch anymore. You just put all your definitions into a bean context. I'm talking about a Spring bean factory context file. Also, if you're working within large projects where you have, say, 10 different modules, then you probably have a dozen or more application contexts. Now, the best thing to do with Spring, if you use EJB, you're going to have the application server will instantiate a whole load of beans, and then you'll have more than 100 application contexts for no reason at all. So this friend here, the context singleton bean factory, which I never remember the name, is your best friend. You just have one bean, master bean context file, which references all the application, all the other 10 or more application contexts. And most application servers will provide a non-J2EE standard feature so that you can initialize this bean factory, this master bean factory, in for example, in BA WebLogic's application lifecycle listener, or IBM WebSphere startup beans. So that's the way you would initialize your master bean context. I would say if you've got an application that uses entity beans, then switching to an ORM mapping solution is going to be helpful. If you've got existing JDBC and you're thinking of using Hibernate with Spring, then the Hibernate template is your very best friend, because it does a whole lot of donkey work for you. For example, it translates the exceptions, and you would have to think a little bit about what you need if you're going to pull in a lot of value objects using lazy or versus eager. So moving swiftly on to a different topic, if you have a multiple tiered application, 3 tiers or more, so you have a back-end tier and a database tier and a web tier, and suppose they all sit on different JVMs. Now, if you're used to writing a little bit of Ajax applications, your Ajax developer doesn't really want a persistence-capable object coming over the wire. He wants a simple Java POJO, or value object. And now the instance here, what happens is that your Ajax developer will make a change to that POJO and send you that value object back to the back-end tier. Now, the problem you will have, and Hibernate can't help you in that regard, is writing this object back to the database. And of course, the ORM solutions only have one instance of an object in memory. So you don't want to really, you're trying to avoid duplicate objects in exceptions here. So you have to come up with your own merging. And there are a few libraries like Common Bean Utils that can help you do that using reflection. Okay, if you have to do any JDBC, prefer JDBC templates because you'll get through it a lot faster. You get rid of all of that try-catch boilerplate code. And the one thing that I did see in an existing enterprise application is that it had an external connection, I don't know, to the database. And so you have an EAR, an application that would modify that database, and Hibernate had no idea what was going on. So you probably have to think how you would update the database from the Hibernate point of view. When you are writing or refactoring or re-architecting an application, then you need to get out the habit of trying to develop your own database. Sometimes it's just not worth the hassle to try to migrate to hypersonic, the issue of creating sequences or, you know. Stateless session beans, for me, are still key because you can declare transactions very easily. There's no reason why I can see why you want to use the transaction manager inside the application. If you are using a J2EE application like WebLogic, it's perfectly good, only for very specialized applications. So instead of relying on Spring then to do those kind of transactions, you should really look at stateless session beans and bind all your service beans together and access them through a stateless session bean. But of course, if you're using just a web container, then your mileage varies differently. Spring is the best way to perform declarative transactions. Now, if you have existing EJ beans, and you most likely have stateless session beans, then you should refactor those to Spring managed beans, which are just a delegated POJO. It allows you to access your EJBs and the logic outside the container in unit tests. And it definitely helps testing scenarios. The thing about entity EJBs I've written there is that you can, if you know what you're doing, translate those to Hibernate or another ORM solution. But I've never seen a case for a distributed JDBC result set yet, but they may have had reasons, the management, for wanting that. So if they do want something like that, then it might be a good idea to replace that with a web service or something else. If you're doing any sort of messaging, prefer the JMS templates. I know that some big corporations love to write their own proprietary messaging frameworks over JMS. There's no reason to use that anymore. Just get rid of and use the JMS templates. Having said that, sometimes the messaging teams in banks and other places prefer to use TIBCO or IBM MQ. And I've heard of people exactly subclassing a JMS template, and so that they could have TIBCO JMS templates that does certain proprietary things. Like okay, if you are using Spring and Hibernate in a legacy J2EE application, one of the things that will help is a retry interceptor. And that will, if you have a database connection that sometimes goes down at 9 o'clock in the morning, WebSphere, I believe, and WebLogic will guarantee that if you call that connection again, it will, if the connection is available, the database is available, it will automatically try to reconnect to the database for you. So a retry interceptor is really a good thing if you're deploying an application to the internet and you have internet users. You really don't want to get called at 12 o'clock, midnight, or whatever time. Yes, the stuff there, like performance monitoring and transactions. Right, development methodologies. Well, I would say Spring frees up your time writing boilerplate code. And you can get better testing, you can improve the performance of your applications in some respects by switching to Hibernate and then investigating removing all the old legacy code that was there before, which sometimes is written in an old traditional pattern, whereas rewriting it in a new pattern, sometimes you have entity beans that were performing multiple selects because you couldn't do joins. Rewriting that in Hibernate, because you can use joins and transactions, makes your application much better. And the best way to force through a legacy, the architecture of the application, is obviously to sit down with the management and target the projects. I'm talking about if you have a large project which has many sorts of different modules. If you target it one module at a time, apply an agile approach to it, and run the unit tests. And because you're re-architecting, moving from entity beans to Hibernate, then you need to have a battery of unit tests. So, the long-term implications. Yes, long-term implications instead of implementation. Well, the JavaEE5 is here. What you need to think about when you re-architect an application is it worth it? What are you going to get out of it? Are you going to get better performance? You need to think through the whole use case. Because if you leave that application alone, eventually software becomes stale and old and the application becomes on maintenance mode. And it even transcends to recruiting developers from even in the internal team or the external team. Nobody really wants to be coding something that's 5 years old. So step-by-step refinement, changing the application slowly will get you there. And I would think that if you are thinking about moving to JavaEE, there are certain, the EE standard is compatible, let me say that again. The EJB3 standard, if you use those beams, is compatible with the 2.x standard. And so you can use your legacy entity beams within EJB3, and you can work step by step to transform those over. So it's a really good idea to use legacy to refactor Java 2E applications into. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much. If there's any questions.
I have one question.
Right.
Could you go back to the previous slide? Oh no, sorry. You say, well, you said ORM, Hibernate is the new persistence API. What do you mean by that? Will it point to the site exactly?
I think that's what I meant to say. ORM, and I should have put a slash in there for top link, and JDO, you know, is the new persistent Hive API. And that, what I mean is that, you know, things are going to be written in the future with the Java persistence API, you know, because it's the standard. That people may still prefer to write Hibernate directly, you know, instead of sticking with the standard. But it's the question I asked you, which one is going to be the new king? If that answered your question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as I know, it's the big application server providers have yet to come out with a JavaEE server at the moment.